Welcome to The Economist Next Door, a podcast where we make complex economic ideas accessible. No PhD required. There's some significant infighting on the political right.
The alliance of the left and the right in favor of state direction, control, management of the economy for conservative ends, I find that absolutely horrifying.
History is full of examples of the danger of using the state to advance a certain vision of morality.
In today's episode, I'm joined by Nathan Schlueter, professor of philosophy and religion at Hillsdale College, and by Nikolai Wenzel, professor of economics and director of the Masters in Economics program at the virtual Universidad de las Hesperides, as well as a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. We'll be discussing the idea of fusionism, or how philosophers, economists, and political scientists have tried to reconcile reason with tradition and freedom with virtue. We'll also talk about how fusionism functions as a kind of intellectual alliance between libertarians and conservatives. I'm particularly excited about this discussion because both Nathan and Nikolai were professors of mine when I was studying at Hillsdale College. They co-taught a class on the libertarian conservative debate and ultimately published a book on the topic entitled Selfish Libertarians and Socialist Conservatives? I recently also wrote a white paper for AIER on the topic called Fusionism, Past, Present, and Conservative Liberal Future. Let's get started. Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining me on this podcast of The Economist Next Door. I'm looking forward to our conversation here. I thought it would be good just to start for our listeners, just to learn a little bit more about you and your background and your interest in this sort of fusionist topic. Obviously, we're going to get into what that means. So feel free to share as much or as little as you want. Nathan, why don't we start with you? Just a little bit of your background and how you came to be interested in these ideas.
Sure. So I studied political philosophy at the University of Dallas in graduate school, very much of a great books type program, politics, literature, philosophy, and probably I would say more of a traditionalist conservative background there. Came to Hillsdale in 2005 and really at that time met my first true believer libertarians, including our esteemed other guest here. And that was a great experience for me, very, very provocative. I was introduced to a lot of literature that challenged a lot of the things that I thought to be the case. And I was challenged to respond to those things. And I haven't stopped, quite frankly, since then. Through my friendship with Nikolai Wenzel, who was in the econ department at the time, we really delved into kind of the core issues separating more traditionalist conservatives, social conservatives from libertarians. We taught a course together at Hillsdale and eventually wrote that up into a book. I learned a lot. I think maybe Nikolai would say he probably learned a lot as well. Our book was published in, I don't remember, maybe 2015. And it seemed as though it was almost dated a year later because of the sort of tsunami of changes that happened in 2016. And within 2 years, I was writing arguments against the arising, at that point, post-liberal movement, what I called anti-liberal. And I think it really is anti-liberal, not post-liberal, is a bit of a misnomer. And so that kind of has been the focus of a lot of my attention for the last 8 or 9 years. And so I feel like I'm kind of right here defending this classical liberal American center in my career from both kind of the extremes of libertarianism on the one hand and post-liberalism on the other. So that's the short of it.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll get into some of that, especially on the post-liberal stuff here soon. So thank you. Nikolai, how about your background here and interest?
Well, first of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here. Really, it is putting the band back together. I learned an immense amount from my colleague Nathan, but also from you, Paul. You were in the prototype class at Hillsdale College. I think it was about 2008 or 9 in your senior year where we had 5 people reading Carey's book. And Nathan, our book actually came out in 2016. It was supposed to come out during the summer, right before the Republican National Convention. And then the book was delayed a few months because of production. And so the book came out a week after President Trump was elected in 2016, and nobody cared at that point about what two professors had to say. My background's a little different. I was a social democrat, Wilsonian institutionalist working for the U.S. State Department, and I was horrified by what I saw. And I thought at that time that one could either be a liberal or a conservative. So I was briefly a conservative, reading the Weekly Standard and sharing it with colleagues in a brown paper bag so that nobody would label us subversives in the leftist State Department. Nothing has changed. But then I was uncomfortable with conservatism because it seemed to be too willing to use the power of the state to advance its own ends, at least the brand of conservatism I was reading about. Fast forward to Hillsdale, where I found that conservative professors, generally in the politics department, would take potshots at their libertarian colleagues and call them immoral and naive. And then libertarian professors would take potshots at their conservative colleagues and call them anywhere from socialists of the right to fascist and other unkind things. Nathan and I realized, well, wait a minute, we're a college, we're a center of inquiry. Enough with the potshots, let's have a class together. And so we had a class where we read some of the core texts in libertarianism, conservatism, fusionism, ranging all the way from Plato to Murray Rothbard to have an honest inquiry. And that's where the book came from. So I'm eternally grateful to Nathan for my own intellectual development. And perhaps the only bad news for this podcast is after so many years of collaboration, we should disagree on more, but we don't.
Well, then there's hope, right? Hope to have some kind of meeting of the minds and find common ground here. And that's really what fusionism is about in a lot of ways, right? It's about this attempt to find common ground between those who are really focused on liberty and those who are really concerned about justice, those who are concerned about tradition, and those who want to order their lives according to reason, and whether those things are in conflict or whether they can be harmonized. So I think, again, many listeners probably are not particularly familiar with fusionism. So maybe we should talk a little bit about where it came from and some of the kind of early thinkers. You know, we could talk about Carey or Frank Meyer. I wrote a review of this new biography of Frank Meyer recently. It's called Mr. Fusionism by this author. And so maybe, I'll open it up here if either of you want to jump in terms of where did fusionism kind of come from? Who are some of its advocates and what were they trying to do? This is, going back half a century here almost.
Well, I'm not an historian, so I don't profess expertise in this area. I rely on people like George Nash and others to tell a bit of that story. But Frank Meyer is considered the father of fusionism. And the idea was that the deep apparent disagreement between libertarians and social conservatives was maybe a bit artificial, that there could be a kind of harmonious, coherent public philosophy that was predicated on both sort of limited government, high regard for liberty, but also affirmed the importance and value of virtue, the need for public virtue. And so my view is that Meyer's own fusionism was maybe a bit too simplistic. I do think that it was a little bit of a libertarian leaning hodgepodge. That was my sense of it. So I've never described myself as a fusionist. I don't use that word. I in your article, you refer to conservative liberalism, and I think that would be a title I'd be more ready to embrace and identify with. I mean, I do think that a deep kind of fusion, there is a place where fusion is, where perfect liberty and perfect virtue can coexist, and it's called the Garden of Eden. And after we were booted out of the Garden of Eden, I think there is a kind of permanent tension between these two. And I don't profess any kind of deep, systematic, or deductive way in which those can be disentangled and neatly recombined. I think it's just a very difficult and therefore very interesting question. But I think, so my view is that whatever fusionism is, it's going to probably be much more on the level of a pragmatic working coalition where the deep comprehensive views underlying those are going to be kind of fluid. There's going to be a lot of disagreement. And what I would ask for inside that coalition is simply a kind of willingness to acknowledge reasonable disagreements. I think it gets problematic when there's a kind of just dismissiveness from a kind of an ideological background and a more concerned with ideological purity than with achieving some immediate results that are maybe less than perfect. So those are just kind of my immediate thoughts about fusionism.
So naturally, I agree with those, but I want to add a few things. The first one is there are many strains of conservatism, and at least the main thrust of American conservatism, if we are looking at conserving something that is associated with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, maybe not as they played out politically immediately. I'm thinking immediately cut off slavery at the pass, but if we're looking at conserving the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, looking at preserving the Constitution, looking at conserving small government, then that strain of American conservatism has a natural alliance with libertarians, if that is what is being conserved. So within the U.S. tradition, it makes sense that the two would be allied. I think also the important part is the notion of a common enemy. Post-World War II through 1989, it made sense. I was going to say that reasonable minds, and I'm tipping my hand about the way I feel about socialism, reasonable minds in the U.S. would be worried about an internal threat and a foreign threat. The foreign threat, of course, Soviet expansionism and Soviet ICBMs and the very notion of what communism represents. But internally, the rise of the administrative welfare state, which of course had started in the 1930s and under Woodrow Wilson before then. But the real rise in the 50s and 60s, the new alphabet soup of departments, the takeover of education, the takeover of welfare, Johnson's Great Society. So it would make sense that conservatives and libertarians would be allied against those threats. Now, after 1989, things got a little bit tricky because the Soviet threat was no longer there, at least as far as the Soviet Union was concerned. And there was an internal soul searching in terms of the international role of the U.S. This is where you get, without getting into too many details, strains like the neoconservatives who wanted to export democracy versus the more cautious paleoconservatives versus more isolationist libertarians. But past 1989, there was still a skepticism about the internal welfare state and the percentage of GDP that is controlled, if I may speak like an economist, the percentage of the economy that is controlled by the state. And there can be reasonable disagreement amongst people who are identifying the same sclerosis, even if they have different approaches to it. And I think where that breaks apart is two parts. One is, if I may jump ahead a little bit, when certain strains of conservatives, the national conservatives, start wanting to expand small government or use the existing administrative state to advance their goals or conservative goals, that's where libertarians start getting uncomfortable. And also libertarians will look at conservatives and say, well, okay, you have convinced me of the importance of virtue. Nathan has convinced me about the importance of virtue. I don't know if I speak for all libertarians, but I'm not comfortable with a state that mucks up everything it touches, advancing virtue through the powers of the state. And this is before the national conservatives. This is all the way back to Reagan. A state that can't run the trains on time or take care of poor people or so many other things or handle education is certainly not going to be able, in the eyes of a libertarian, to advance virtue in the population. So that's where the coalition starts falling apart, is when libertarians look at that and say, well, let's get out of the way first and then see what happens.
Yeah, no, it's good historical context. And I mean, I think that brings us up to the current day. You know, one of the points that the economist Friedrich Hayek makes in his postscript of the Constitution of Liberty is he says part of why, say, classical liberals or libertarians get along so well with American conservatives is that American conservatives are trying to conserve many kind of classical liberal elements in the founding of limited government, of free enterprise. And, you know, as Nathan, as you alluded to, part of what we're seeing now is very explicit rejections even of the founding on the right. And so you're beginning to see, you know, whether it's Patrick Deneen saying like, yeah, the founding was pretty classical liberal and that's a problem, right? To Enlightenment or to whatever. And we can go into some details there. But I want to, as we think about the modern world and think about like our listeners who are kind of looking at the political landscape, part of what I tell people, this is a little bit of insider baseball in terms of academic philosophers, but I think part of why this matters is it helps address, like, why do these people who seem like they should be on the same team hate each other? And it's not just like libertarians, conservatives. I mean, why does Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, right? Why are they at each other's throats, right? Why is there this divide with Megyn Kelly or Candace Owens? Or, you pick your figure, there's some significant infighting on the political right. And I think it has a lot to do with the Fusionist project or those who are leaving the Fusionist project, right? Who the way I describe this is are kind of reactionary as opposed to conservative in any kind of like traditional sense. And I think they are rejecting some of these classical liberal elements that we'll unpack here. But Nathan, you've written about this a lot. I'm curious what you would add or how you would describe this infighting that's going on the right and kind of how we're seeing this play out because of some of these shifts and what people care about and how they think about the founding even.
Yeah. So I am obviously very worried about the rise of populist post-liberalism, more concerned about the scholars that have, to me, aided and abetted that movement in ways that kind of shock me that they should know better. I generously would just say that I'm kind of shocked by the kind of ignorance about sort of basic economics, the kind of bad caricatures of how markets work, the failure to sort of target the right things, the kind of straw men has been really disappointing to me. But I think it's important to try to understand what's motivating the disaffection of post-liberals, because there's a deep psychology and a rhetoric there. And if we don't understand that, anything we try to do to promote a free and virtuous society is going to be futile. We've got to understand what the concerns are here. And I would say I see two things. I see one, immigration, the neglect of immigration by Democrats and Republicans for decades, the kind of open borders and the sort of stresses that put on culture and on the system that just got unaddressed. I mean, it does seem to me that any notion of, and Nicola and I have a little exchange on this, but I still personally, I'm just being honest here, I find any notion of open borders just utterly kind of utopian. The idea that we could ever have just open borders. And I don't mean that the system has to be completely closed. I just mean you've got to control your border for various reasons, which is a conversation worth having. So I think there was a great deal of disillusionment about our inability or unwillingness to control borders. That was clearly a big source of disaffection. And that combined with, I think, the obvious pressures and dysfunctions in our culture that are rooted in the breakdown of marriage and the family. And that to me is another and Nicola and I also exchange on this issue in the book. And that's another one where I think, to me, it seems obvious. It seems that there's overwhelming data that you cannot have a free and virtuous society without intact biological marriages, that dissociating completely marriage from politics and promoting sort of individual choice in this area overlooks all of what we know about the needs of children, their socialization, their care, development, education. There's so much evidence on this. So I think the post-liberals just were seeing a lot of alienation from an isolation, obviously from wokeism and other things too, but from those two things. I think the problem, the big problem I see is that the post-liberals seem to have embraced, or they're much more friendly to the administrative state, as Nikolai mentioned, and they're very friendly to economic interventions that, the alliance of the left and the right in favor of state direction, control, management of the economy for conservative ends. I find that absolutely horrifying and shocking. And unexpected, frankly. I've learned so much from Nikolai about the way markets work, especially Hayek. I think that's one of the best gifts that Nikolai gave me, was the encouragement opportunity to really read deeply on Hayek. And I had all these prejudices about Hayek. that came from other sources before I'd ever read him. And the more I read, the more convinced I became by most of the analysis about the way knowledge is generated, the knowledge problem, spontaneous orders, etc. Of course, Hayek is not a libertarian. We all know this. He's very much in favor of limited uses of government to deal with these, pardon the language, externalities, positive, negative externalities. But he also thought ways to deal with them would be through planning for, harnessing civil society rather than just supplanting it. So there's this notion of subsidiarity. So I think we've got a real task here. I think conservatives, just to summarize, I'm talking too long, but I think that this conservative liberalism needs to persuade the post-liberals to learn a little more about how these markets work, to not confuse the free market with neoliberalism, corporate capitalism, welfare capitalism. I think there's a really important conversation to have. But secondly, I think libertarians really need to acknowledge those concerns from that's motivating the post-liberals. They need to acknowledge that open borders is a fanciful kind of policy, and that intact biological marriage really is the least expensive way humanity has ever known for reducing crime, minimizing crime, promoting employment, promoting good human development. So that's where I kind of see that important space that needs to be addressed.
Great. Well, no lot can be said, Nikolai. I'll let you make some comments here, and then I'll kind of redirect us a little bit. But I think that sets things up well.
Well, Nathan, I have to start by saying that the favor was returned, except your readings that you suggested to me were perhaps a bit arcane. Hannah Pitkin and Wilmore Kendall were the two most influential political philosophy works, but we're getting off track. I think I agree with almost everything Nathan said, and this is a marginal disagreement that we've had. I don't want to toot our own horns here, but my disagreement with Nathan reminds me of the disagreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They both wanted liberty, and they both wanted a framework to advance liberty and human flourishing, but they disagreed on what that framework should be. So Nathan and I can agree on the goal and the outcome without necessarily agreeing on all the details of how to get there, in a way, for example, that I cannot agree with socialism. And I think the most important point, Nathan, that you just made is that even if we're horrified by these things, and I find myself now making arguments against the new post-liberals, national conservatives that I was making against socialists 15 years ago, but trying to understand them. Where is this coming from? And the first one is, generously, how do we understand post-liberals and national conservatives? There's a way to dismiss them as simply saying, well, they finally got into power in some way, shape, or form, and they're excited to use that power. I think that applies to some, but I think there's also a realism about the tools. Nathan and I want to dismiss the administrative welfare state, and I think many of those who want to use it to advance conservative means are realistic about the fact that it's not going to disappear anytime soon. And I do think that there is an identification of a real problem in U.S. society and in Western society, but the diagnosis is incorrect. So the claim of post-liberalism, I think, comes down to the notion that classical liberalism, the American constitutional model, free markets, whatever you might call it, is exhausted. People aren't getting by the way that they used to on one job, families falling apart, we have rising crime, changes in national identity, some people are being left behind, etc. And certainly there's an internal challenge to capitalism, which Daniel Bell and others have identified, the notion that capitalism is fundamentally based on a culture of saving, but as soon as the next generation gets rich, it becomes a culture of consumption. And so we lose something in the virtues that are necessary for capitalism. But I think it's deeper than that. And this dirty word that Nathan used, cronyism, I think is largely the problem. So if we look at this, some people are being left behind in the global economy. And economists since Adam Smith have been telling us that trade's good for everybody. Okay, you might have a few short-term losers. But let's look at things like the fact that the federal government controls 25% of the national economy compared to the functions in Article 1, Section 8, and what I call the We Mean It Amendment, the 10th Amendment. So any non-enumerated powers go back to the states. Throw in an extra 15% of national expenditure controlled by the states, another 10% or so of regulatory compliance, cost of compliance every year with federal regulations. And we are looking at not quite half the economy, it hit half, that is controlled by the state today. That's not a free market system. That is not a free market system. Education, K through 12, is bankrupt. And we occasionally, I don't know where Hillsdale finds them. I'm going to be mean here and say that it's mostly homeschool students because they always end up being the best. But we have a generation or two of students who are really good at feelings, really good about being worried about the environment, really good about me atomism, and really good about identifying harms, real or invented, that have been done to them, as opposed to coming out with a deep, profound notion of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also civic responsibilities and family responsibilities. I don't think more state, I know that more state is not the answer to that. So we need a return to the market. We need a return to a thriving civil society. And this is where I think Nathan and I disagree on some of the details on immigration and marriage. I'll just touch upon this briefly. On the breakdown of marriage and the family, I think we need to start looking at the welfare state and its effects on the family. We need to look at education and its effects on the family. We need to look at the crowding out of civil society by the welfare state. We need to look at the crowding out of religion before we start imposing any laws to try to advance marriage, because I do believe also that a marriage society is important. But I don't think a federal government or a state government that's incapable of having trains run on time or taking care of poor people or providing basic education is going to be the tool to advance marriage. Likewise, on immigration, I have been very worried about the stresses on culture, but perhaps we can start by looking at the fact that the kinds of goods and services that most immigrants are using are not provided by the market, and they're thus not responding to the growth of immigration. I don't think we have open borders. I think that may be a philosophical aspiration for libertarians and a boogeyman for post-liberals. But let's start looking at things that state provision of education, which is going to be unresponsive, zoning laws, which makes it difficult to find housing, job licensing laws, which are going to make it difficult for both immigrants and for native-born populations to continue competing, regulation and the rise in regulation and regulatory compliance, taxes, and the general suffocating influence of the state. So I think before we have any what I would call positive state measures in the sense of the states or the federal government trying to advance virtue or trying to protect marriage or trying to curb immigration, let's start by looking at what socialism, and I'm going to call it socialism when 40% of the U.S. economy is controlled by the state. Let's start at looking at the negative effects of socialism and the crowding out problems.
Yeah, I don't think you'll find a lot of disagreement there. I think you're unusual, though, in some ways. I think the concern, having run in a lot of libertarian circles myself, is that not a lot of libertarians are super comfortable talking about marriage as a human good that should be encouraged and that we should want to see, right? They might not like the Department of Education because it's government, but like you should just be able to do what you want, and like marriage is just, an option. I think they're not often willing to speak to, no, we think like marriage is a great thing and like we would love to see more of it. Now, again, that doesn't mean you like give marriage bonuses or, some kind of government, but to just acknowledge like marriage is a not just a useful institution, but a good one. And, whether it's education or tax structure is bad, not just because it's the government getting involved in people's business. Like, sure, that's bad, but it's like especially bad because it's destroying this really good institution. And a lot of libertarians, or some at least, are very hesitant to make that case. And so, I'm just going to lay out here kind of where I think fusionism is helpful is I kind of describe three areas that I think fusionists are kind of committed to or that they share in common. So belief in free enterprise is really important. A commitment to limited government, which we've talked about, people moving away from that, but commitment to limited government. But then this third element of sort of commitment or belief in a transcendent moral order. And I think that's one that tends to trip up more libertarians often in terms of, well, what is this moral order? What role does it play? Is it anything other than personal, private choice? You've expressed concern about trying to cultivate virtue, and I totally share that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean government needs to do these things, but I think even being willing to speak to the importance of these things would go a long way. And so when I think about like this fusionist landscape, I think these three buckets, right? Limited government, free enterprise, and transcendent moral order explains why post-liberals are not fusionists, right? They're not committed to limited governments and they're not in favor of free enterprise really at all. It also, I think, and maybe this is fair, maybe not, I think it's also why radicals, in the political sense of the term, radical libertarians, say like an Ayn Rand or a Murray Rothbard, also don't really fit in the fusionist tradition, right? And that's not to say that they don't have good economics or that we can't learn from them or read, but they're not really in the same kind of camp, right? That the way they think about morals, I think, is very different versus like a Hayek or a Buchanan. I think, obviously they don't have the same views as someone like Russell Kirk, kind of more traditional conservative, but they could talk to each other. Like they would acknowledge and recognize, okay, no, we understand tradition's important and, not every choice people make is morally neutral or is equally good or bad, or they're willing to kind of have that conversation that there's not some kind of either moral relativism or complete neutrality. And in this regard, again, for listeners, I think something that might be helpful, and I'm curious about your reaction to this as well, is something I like or want to kind of bring back with talking about fusionism more is kind of hearkening back, I think, to some really important figures who we could maybe call kind of proto-fusionists in a way. And so you think about kind of in the 18th century, you have Adam Smith, kind of father of economics. You have Edmund Burke. Many people think of him as like the father of conservatism early on. Or then you have like Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1800s kind of writing about democracy in America and observing that. I think all three of these figures are hard to categorize. They're sometimes called conservatives and they're sometimes called liberals. Sometimes they're reformers. Sometimes they're traditionalists. And I find that very appealing. And I think there's something consistent about their way of thinking about the idea that tradition is important and custom, but it doesn't mean that we don't use our reason to try to make reforms on the margin and try to improve things without being radicals, right? Kind of like a French Enlightenment, burn it all down, which again, I think is what we're seeing today, whether it's post-liberals or, democratic socialists. There's this radical element of like, let's burn the system down. It's not working for us. It's corrupt. It's whatever you want to say to it. We need to burn it down. And that's something I think fusionists, libertarian or conservative in bent, would be very hesitant. Like, well, wait a second. Let's put a pause to burning everything down and think through like the bad things maybe that we should burn down, but like let's not try to burn everything down and just start over again. So anyway, so I kind of am sort of putting that radicalism sort of outside the camp, so to speak. Again, not that we don't interact with them or learn from them, but I see that as something different maybe than what kind of this fusionist camp is about.
Paul, I have a question about your piece, which I really enjoyed. First question is, why do you use the phrase transcendent moral order? Why that adjective transcendent?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in part, I'm sort of drawing from Russell Kirk, who used that phrase a lot. And then I think the other reason is I guess, what does the transcendent add to it? I think it's the idea that there's something universal or objective about it. And so, and again, this is where, I really wrestled on this with Rand and Rothbard, because it's not that they don't believe that morality exists, right? They have a certain kind of conception of it, but it just doesn't really fit the way, the other kind of figures I lumped in the camp think about it in terms of this sort of transcending time and place and something that endures and that we're trying to understand. So it's not a great answer to your question. Yeah. So it's go ahead.
Talk about it for a moment, because to me it suggested a kind of theological requirement. When I saw transcended, it suggested, okay, he wants a theological ground for the moral life. When I think what he really wants is just a kind of moral realism, a sort of belief that there's, as you said, a universe, that there's something in our nature that is objective, about that grounds an objective moral order. And now, as I'm hearing you speak, I see even better that, yeah, Rothbard is a moralist as well as anyone else. The non-aggression axiom is a moral principle. But what I think what you really want to defend, and if it's true, I agree with it. We want a conception of morality which is really pegged to a more robust view of human flourishing, and not just a minimal sort of setting, what Nozick called these sort of boundaries around you, but actually, are we actually thinking about human flourishing as a kind of healthy human growth and development, so we can actually say, a homeless drug addict is not simply living according to their various subjective value, opportunity costs, etc. But we can really say, no, they're not flourishing. This is a very bad situation. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I agreed with almost, and your response to Nikolai I thought was really good. I agreed with everything Nikolai said. Maybe I'd have to take that back if I played it on slow, just to listen again. But I was nodding my head about all of it. And so when I say, and I think, Paul, when you say, when we're talking about a concern for human flourishing in this robust way, we're not necessarily talking about a virtue police, a state-enforced virtue police or cops or something like this. We're just saying that the stability of the political order, no matter what it is, it's gonna be good or bad depending on whether people are flourishing in it or not. You just can't ignore it. And the proposals, and so I would not be in favor of using the government to try and make people virtuous. That's not a view I'm in favor of. I don't think most conservatives that I spend time with would be in favor of that, but they also don't think government can be neutral between various ways of life, and that it can play an indirect role in protecting flourishing. And marriage, I think, is just a really great kind of testing point, because it's not how you define marriage doesn't involve lots of government resources. It's not redistributive in any bad way. It doesn't require a massive regulatory bureaucracy to enforce it. It is simply acknowledging a kind of it's providing a kind of legal recognition and enforcement that's, in my view, no different than protecting rights or something like that. So having some law and no-fault divorce.
Yeah, and I think what I would add, like part of the transcendent moral order, what I had in mind, and transcendent doesn't really capture this, but it's the idea that we can use moral language in our reasoning and not simply choice language.
Right.
And so one of the things I've written about is when we think about subjective value from an economic standpoint, like subjective value is very deeply true. But it's not the whole story. Like somehow when we talk about someone's preference for chocolate over vanilla, there's not a lot of moral weight in that of like, well, you're wrong for liking chocolate or something like that. And so we can see, well, that's just subjective. That's not some kind of essential or moral element. But my preference for marriage over pornography or for working hard versus taking psychedelic drugs, now all of a sudden, well, yeah, it's your preference. There's subjective value here, but we've moved somehow from the chocolate vanilla distinction. And we need to have some way of sort of like talking about this, even if we decide government should do nothing, right? And should allow people free to take drugs and decriminalize or legal, like that's a related question. But just this on the flourishing point or the moral point, can we talk about the moral dimensions of subjective choice and what does that look like? And that's kind of what I want to try to get in here. And I think again, like Hayek and I know Buchanan a little bit less well, I think they would be open to that. And it's less clear that, let's say, a Rothbard or a Rand would, or at least they would do it differently than I would do it. But Nikolai, I'll let you jump in on this point.
So I've always been of two minds about fusionism. If fusionism means that I'm hanging out at conferences and in libraries and preferably over a nice glass of scotch or a martini or bourbon with people who are enjoining me and reminding me to think about the moral dimensions of a free society and not just my choices, but what is good for society, then I'm in with fusionism. I'm on a big aesthetics kick right now to the extent that I think human flourishing starts, of course, with economic opportunity and with individual virtue. But architecture over the past 50 years is by and large, a brutal assault to human flourishing. and the spaces that we've created. Now, a lot of that has to do with Bauhaus roots and the state getting involved in housing and urban development. The music that the kids are listening to, I was just having a mini debate about Alan Bloom, who was worried about rock and roll. Oh my goodness, if the kids today could just listen to Elvis and Dion and the Belmonts, the harmonies of the Grateful Dead, instead of the garbage or insipid drivel that they're listening to these days. I've got teenage nieces who are wonderful little human beings, and I adore them, but they're listening to garbage, so I try to steer them in the right direction of good music. But back on a more serious note, what I start worrying about is that in those three buckets that you have, too many conservatives, even before National Conservative and even before post-liberalism, were willing to impinge on the first two to advance the third. Too many conservatives were willing to have, even if it was gentle morals legislation and police powers at the state levels or at the federal level, even some things that might be relatively soft, any attempt, I think, because this transcendent moral order I find is problematic. How do we know the truth? And I'm horrified also at relativism and postmodernism. I do believe there's truth that can be found, and we find it through inquiry. We find it through reason. We find it through, I don't know if you want to call it revelation, Nathan, might be the language that you would use, a Hayekian emergence perhaps of norms, which I think is parallel. But this transcendent moral order, which is it? Is it going to be Christian? Is it going to be Catholic or Protestant? To what extent can the state use it? And I find the history is full of examples of the danger of using the state to advance a certain vision of morality. And this is where I think Nathan and I disagree on not the goal, but the neutrality of the state. I think the place for virtue is civil society. It's the family. It's the churches. It's the Tocquevillian clubs and associations. And I don't know many radical libertarians who are not worried in some way, shape, or form about virtue, the importance of self-governance, the importance of taking care of each other, the importance of tithing to your church or donating time to your corner of civil society to make it better. Even Ayn Rand has her own version of the importance of virtue, if you look at Atlas Shrugged. But the problem comes with the state intervention. And this is where I think, just to close things up, because I know we're running out of time, Smith, Burke, and Tocqueville, I think, defy some of the modern labels. And I don't like the left versus right label that comes from the French Revolution. I think more in terms of people who favor liberty and human flourishing. And within that umbrella, there's a disagreement of the anarcho-capitalists who might be very concerned with virtue, but think that any state is going to be a bad thing. We can agree or disagree with them, but agree with their goals. The Misesian minarchists who think that a minimal state is the best way. And then the Hayeks, Friedmans, and Buchanans of this world. And I would say also natural law liberals like Nathan, who are willing to have more than a minimal state, but are not lapsing into some form of scary interventionism. And so perhaps that's the way to think about those kinds of thinkers, because they were concerned with virtue, they were concerned with tradition, they were concerned with civil society, they were concerned with human flourishing, but they were also gravely concerned with placing limits on the state so that we don't violate individual rights.
Yeah, that's right. And, I want to go back to something Nathan mentioned early on that I think is really key here, which is just the living with the tensions, right? So I think I agree with your assessment. Frank Meyer was pretty optimistic of like, oh, no, these things are totally consistent and weave together and but I think you're right. I think there's these tensions, and Nikolai, you put it well. And part of the conversation I want to have, part of why I wrote this paper, is trying to kind of reassess where are things now in kind of this space, and what are people who are kind of like outside or inside, and there's fellow travelers. It's not a binary in or out. But I agree with the tension, Nikolai, and then this is, I think, the conversation we want to press on people is, what you're worried about is the transcendent moral order at the expense of limited government and at the expense of free enterprise. And I think that's right. And I think Nathan would share that concern as well, of like, there's tensions here of like, if it's just free enterprise, we're missing the boat too, if it's just limited government, but not. And so it's, I kind of just sketch these three things as poles, if you will. And, and I think people emphasize different things, right? Some people are very concerned about the state. Some people are a little bit less so. Some people are very concerned about the deterioration of the family. some people a little less so. But I think we're in this constellation of we are all concerned. If we're kind of in the future, we're concerned about all of these things. We have maybe some different levels of concern. We think we're maybe a little bit more towards this pole or that pole, but we're kind of in the same playground, if you will, of this. And I think this is really helpful, especially, again, going back to what I mentioned, like, why is a Tucker Carlson such a dangerous figure in so many ways? He's not committed to free enterprise or to limited government, maybe not even to a transcendent moral order these days. I mean, as you listen to him, and it's really, he's just not part of this camp. And it's important to recognize he's doing something different. And we have a different kind of conversation where he doesn't even acknowledge that these three things are important, or the post-liberals, or just like socialists, right? Socialists don't care certainly about multiple of these poles either. So we are close to time, but kind of concluding brief thoughts, Nathan, Nikolai, on just conversation, maybe where things are going. I know that maybe they're not going in a great direction, but any bright spots or thoughts of how this might be reevaluated on the right?
Bright spots. Well, this podcast is a bright spot. Seeing my good friends here. And, I think America is still a wonderful place to be right now for all the challenges we're facing. I'm grateful to be here. I'm hopeful that if we can get through some of the challenges of the moment, we're going to find ourselves some things rebalancing. That's my sense of this. And I'm obviously deeply troubled by, the protectionist anti-market attitudes that I see among the post-liberals. But I'm seeing that part of that is just disaffected young people. And it goes with their age. It goes, I would have probably been right with them when I was 19, 20, 21. I probably would have been a Groiper for all I know, just as fun. And so we've got to just keep doing our work and building friendships with others and letting them see the complexity. I would just want to second what you said again, that I just think that there's that there's lots of room here. I think all three of us, just hearing us talk on this podcast, there's so much agreement. The differences would be largely strategic. Too much of this, not too much of that. Does this work? Does this not work? And so I'm hopeful. I recently did a survey among my students, one of my classes, because they were talking about how big their families were, and we're talking about the demographic crisis and low fertility rates. And this philosophy class I was teaching with 25 students, and at the fertility rate was 6.2 children per kid in that class. So I was very moved by that. So I'm hopeful.
Good. Nikolai, anything?
I echo a lot of naturally what Nathan says, but I always think it's just as we're hammering away at good ideas, we need to understand why people are embracing bad ideas. And I think that was a key point that Nathan made. So this is the 250th anniversary of the American founding. Let's hammer away at the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? And what is the purpose of the state? To advance these rights. But I think it's also the opportunity. So I see a pushback against DEI, which is wonderful because DEI is divisive and inherently racist. As we're pushing back against DEI, let's think about the kinds of individual and institutional barriers to opportunity for groups that have been left out. As we're emphasizing the importance of free markets and keeping the state out of it, let's think about the causes of poverty and institutional barriers to growth and regulation and the presence of the state. So I think this is the opportunity not just to emphasize all the good things about the 250th, but emphasize that many of the bad things that are happening today are due to the expanding administrative welfare state.
And I think on that, there's a lot of agreement among folks who are like-minded like us. Well, thank you both for joining us. It was great to reconnect and for the conversation. Appreciate you being willing to come on here.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.